Hello and welcome to this Business Plus special. Today we're talking about mental health, mental illness, and the things that we can do as a community and with the help of professionals to make things better for others. With me today in the studio, after 3 years, is Dr. Veronica Carey. Dr. Carey is the professor at Drexel University, Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in the United States. She's also the co-chair of the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association of the United States. Welcome to Business Plus, and thank you so much for being here. I know it's been 3 long years, but we hope next time it won't be this long. And with Dr. Carey is Shaheen Ahmed. Shaheen Ahmed is a member of the Bergen County Mental Health Board. She's also a member of the National Association of Mental Illness, NAMI, in the United States. She's the founder, president of Caravan of Light in the US and in Pakistan, and most importantly, she's a caregiver. And that's her capacity, that's the capacity in which she'll be talking to us today. And I think we're going to have to rely on a lot of your experience and knowledge of how one should move forward in all this. So you've been holding a conference in Karachi, you've held a conference in Karachi, and your focus was on building a behavioral health workforce for mental illness. So, before we get into the specifics, etc., maybe you'd like to just explain to all of our viewers, what is mental illness? How do you diagnose it? I mean, when people say, oh, you're nuts, is that mental illness? What is mental illness?
Right. So for example, mental illness is something that actually is a diagnosis. So individuals might be diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or PTSD, and it's something that impacts their ability to function. It impacts their brain. So we had an opportunity a couple years ago back to explain about how mental illness impacts an individual. So it impacts their ability to do day-to-day functions in the amount of time that maybe someone without the diagnosis might actually take. There are some positive symptoms of mental illness, meaning that this is where the diagnosis comes from. So someone might have hallucinations or delusions or impaired speech or impaired behavior. And if they have these things over a specific period of time, they're said to have this named diagnosis. For example, it might be schizophrenia. So you might see some of those positive symptoms.
And is it something that goes away with medication, or is it something that you always have to monitor? It never leaves you. Because there've been so many different types of treatments over the years. I mean, you've gone from really sort of brutal, drastic things like electrotherapy, and now you have medicines. And
that's actually an excellent question, because when people think about a disease, they want it to go away. We don't have a cure for mental health disorders, but we have hundreds of treatments that help people function more in the community. One of them is medication. And what medication does is it reduces the distress and discomfort of whatever the symptoms are. So if I had maybe hallucinations for months before treatment, then quite possibly I can go for a long tenure of time and not experience hallucinations. Or if I had delusions before any kind of intervention, medication, therapies, psychiatric rehabilitation. There's options now to have more stability for longer periods of time than ever in the history of mental health disorders.
So stability, that's an interesting word, because Shaheen, you're a caregiver, and so you're obviously looking after people who have some sort of mental illness. But how do people respond to people with mental illness? I mean, our society is really cruel anyway. If you're the wrong color, if you're the wrong height, if you're the wrong weight, if you're anything. I mean, you have a pimple, people are cruel.
That's very true. And in the case of mental illness, perhaps the responses are even more extreme. And that is more so because there is very little knowledge about mental illness. We are still in Pakistan at that age where people say, okay, jadoo ho gaya hai, and they'll mazar pe ja rahe hain, those sort of things. And so it is, I think, a lack of education, that it is an illness like all other illnesses. It's no different than diabetes or heart disease, because those don't have cures either. And people have to live with those illnesses, and they do live, and they learn how to manage them. So mental illness is the same. We have to educate people. They have to learn about their own illness and how are they going to manage their illness. But then at the same time, how will they live life? So, you know, you don't give up living because you have that baggage.
Yeah, because what happens is when somebody doesn't understand something, it frightens them, or if something is different and they can't relate to that, they react and they get frightened. They're not, you know, curious, or, you know, they don't feel that, okay, we can go in and try and understand.
Right.
I mean, they automatically pull back and then react in a peculiar way. So how do you deal with that, you know, on a daily basis with people? Because it must be painful to be with someone you care for and see other people reacting to that person.
Absolutely. And I think the important part of that is, well, I'm not living here. I live in the US, and my family members are in Pakistan. And their illnesses go back 50 years. So I think in that respect, my mother was the caregiver for 50 years of her life. And she was very, very progressive in her thinking, which is important for me to share, that even though she was not an educated person, she made sure that they were part and parcel of everybody else's life. It was almost like a package deal. They come with me, so you must accept them. So she was very progressive, and that her approach to it was, we don't know what's wrong, but there's going to be no judgment coming their way. And that is how we treated our family. But by and large, I think people shy away. They don't want other people to know, and they're probably, you know, hidden away, not to be seen or heard. And that is really what needs addressing.
So, you know, lots of people think that, you know, you get ill because you get a virus, or you get a bug, or you get some kind of infection or something. How do you get mental? I mean, what causes mental illness?
Mental illness is actually biological. It is a brain disorder, a brain disease. So sometimes a mental health diagnosis will run in families. It doesn't mean it'll be in every generation of a family, or it may even sort of morph and change from maybe an existing diagnosis to a different diagnosis. But I happen to teach a genetics and mental health course at the university. And one of the things that we have found, and that students find alarming, meaning that I didn't know that before, not alarming meaning negatively, but I can see it back. I can traffic back maybe in the genealogy of someone. It might have been 2 or 3 generations ago. Because people might think that a person has chosen to have a mental health disorder, or they were using substances, or they were maybe maybe they had a traumatic event, and that's what caused it. But
can a traumatic event cause?
It can be a trigger.
So you'd have some sort of latent problem, and it could just get triggered.
Exactly. And there's usually an age of onset. Most literature will indicate about a 16 to 25 8-year-old age range for the age of onset. So therefore, if someone is experiencing maybe certain milestones in their life, like learning how to drive, or now they're dating, or maybe they're going to college, that's usually the exact same age range when the mental health disorder will appear. So this
but
is
it's
why,
been there under the surface.
Exactly. And this is exactly why, Tammy, what happens is you might meet someone who's 45 years old, their age of onset might have been 19, so there's so many developmental tasks the person hasn't been able to achieve yet, or has taken it more time to achieve them. So chronologically they're 45, but there's some tasks that we assume they haven't even experienced yet.
Right. So you know, you're here in Pakistan, and you're talking about building a behavioral health workforce. What is that? And you know, is this people you're training people to
Exactly.
deal?
I'm glad you asked that question, because we are now moving away from just an awareness, what is it, to a point at which now we're developing a cadre of an eclectic group of professionals to service individuals who are utilizing your behavioral health system. Historically, models have always been clinical model, right? Clinical medication models. And they have a certain worth. They have a great worth in our communities. They're in the US, they're in other countries. So once these individuals, like psychiatrists and psychologists and other therapists, have been able to stabilize individuals, now there's another piece to that puzzle called psychiatric rehabilitation. That's the piece that we're bringing in from these other nations. That's the piece that we're saying, individuals from Pakistan can now go on to live, learn, work, socialize better than ever before, because we have an arsenal of individuals that are studying these practices. So we are so excited and thrilled that I always say, do your jobs and do them well, because then when we have persons who are able to stabilize people, they can move on so much sooner and so much quicker.
So have you done sort of any kind of mapping of Pakistan? Do you know what the extent of the problem is?
It's funny that you asked that, because as a part of the conference, I was alarmed at the number. There are about 200,000 individuals that utilize mental health services here in Pakistan. That we know of, that your system knows of. And usually there's about another double that number that are not utilizing services. So one of the key components of utilizing psych rehab is dialoguing with caregivers and family members.
Because there's always this stigma attached to, to anything. You don't want to go to the doctor for something like this because you don't want anyone to say, there's madness in their family. Because nobody looks at it as an illness. I mean, it gets classified as madness, and that comes, and as you said, it's something that it's hereditary, or it's part of your genetic makeup. So how do you deal with the stigma here?
Presently, I don't think we are dealing with the stigma. We need to come up with a plan to start addressing. Obviously, we, in our work, have started to address this at a conference such as the one yesterday, where we had a caregiver who came up on stage before 200 people and talked about her experience as a caregiver. That gives hope to the other caregivers in the audience to say that we are not alone. They are going through every single thing that we are going through, and then that will take away some of that stigma, the fact that they speak about it. We also had a young doctor who is recovered from mental illness, managed to get through medical school, and now is headed to the US for further studies. He was able to get up there and say, I've had this number of hospitalizations, this number of relapses, and what was his journey, the back and forth, one step forward, two steps backwards, and how he struggled. And there he was standing in front of he was a total inspiration. So those are the sort of things people need to come out and disclose.
So you had people who were caregivers, you had people who were professionals and who had suffered from mental illness themselves. Did you have lots of others like doctors and therapists and psychiatrists?
Well, we aimed the conference to include specifically 3 target populations: the professionals. So we had people, chair of the Jinnah Psychiatric Unit from the Dow Medical College, from other institutions, so that was the professional group that was present. Then we specifically targeted and invited caregivers to be in the audience. And the third group that we invited were students that would hear about this, and we talked about a new career path for Pakistan in psychiatric rehabilitation with a certification at the end of it, because moving rehabilitation forward is not going to be sustainable unless there is a workforce adept at these.
So you have 200,000 people in the system at the moment, and you probably have many multiples of that number outside the system, I'm sure, because this is a huge population, close to 200 million.
Yes.
So I'm sure that there are many more. But do you have enough people to look after the 200,000? I mean, it's not you as in you, but does the system have enough people properly trained? What's lacking?
That is, the training is what is lacking, because the concept of rehabilitation does not exist yet in Pakistan. It is not understood, because basically they feel that you have a mental illness, you're going to be ill for life, and that there's nothing that can be done about it. So you accept that nothing part. Here, rehabilitation, we've been coming for the last 10 years and saying there is hope. There is a way forward. So that conversation is ongoing, and bit by bit by bit, I think we're making strides in people going out. At this conference, the remarks, the feedback that we got just from there was that we need to learn more. That is the encouraging part, that they're open. And this was a student population.
Right.
So
So you've
yes.
got, if you have serious amounts of people with mental illness, and so you must have a multi-pronged approach, obviously, to dealing with the problem.
Absolutely.
You know, so you need to have qualified caregivers or trained caregivers, people who understand how to deal with things. Then, of course, you need to have the latest kind of medical breakthroughs and technologies. And what about, you know, counseling and professional therapy, etc., you know, things like that.
Right.
And then how do you take people and bring them into a workforce and then keep them motivated, keep them there?
Right. Well, one of the ways that behavioral health is broken up is in 4 different dimensions. The first one is treatment. So we have those elements that come under treatment services. The goal in a treatment service, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, reduce the distress and discomfort of those symptoms. Then we have basic support. That's meeting those safety, food, shelter needs. So we have services that deliver those entities here in Pakistan. We have something called enrichment. That means that people are taking part so they can go and practice those functional skills that really kind of come under social skills. And then we have rehabilitation. We live our lives vertically, Tammy. We live our lives up and down. The way you and I sustain ourselves throughout the day is through 3 ways: skills, resources, and supports. So psychiatric rehabilitation teaches practitioners how to build upon skills, resources, and supports so that individual can stay as vertical as the person next to them.
I want to come back and go through this a little bit more, and maybe you can elaborate, but we're going to take a very short break. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about mental illness and what can be done to improve the lives of so many people in this country who are suffering from it, with Dr. Veronica Carey and Shaheen Ahmed, both here from the United States. So we were talking just before this about the different steps that one goes through. But, you know, one tends to see that there's lots of prescriptions of medicines. How qualified are doctors? Do they have all the up-to-date resources and knowledge? Do they go for trainings? Do you provide trainings here? And are these drugs easily available or not? Because what I understand is, A, there's no continuing medical education in Pakistan. So that doesn't happen. I mean, if you've qualified as a psychiatrist in 1956, well, you're stuck in 1956,
Yes.
There isn't anything here,
Well, there's something called continuing education. So that psychiatrists might have received their diplomas or their designation in 1956, but there are opportunities for them to do what's called continuing education.
but not here.
So they may use it abroad. They
Yeah.
may even use it on an online status. Because the medications, for the first time in the history of our system, have the most impact than ever before, with the least amount of side effects. Before, the medications had such profound side effects that you had to judge, should I take it, should I not take it, because of the breadth of how it was going to impact me. But now individuals are saying, okay, first of all, with psychoeducation, I can find out, okay, this medication may cause me to have a weight-producing agent. So maybe I should learn how to change my diet. Or it may cause me to hypo or hypersalivate. So maybe I should reach for different, less calorie-laden sodas. So all that information is readily available, even if it's utilized just from the website. But we also educate the individual. That never
Yes.
historically happened. So we have language for caregivers, we have language for staff, we have language for participants. Now we have a workforce.
So you're training them in Pakistan.
We are training them primarily in psychiatric rehabilitation.
Okay.
That is our primary charge.
Right.
Okay. So for again, I'll come back to the whole thing of what about hospitalization here? If someone has to go into hospital, or are there special wards here? Do they know how to deal with patients, or are they using old archaic methods? Have they kind of moved to the 21st century?
Well, there are hospital. acute care can only be dealt with in
a
a
hospital.
hospital setting, in a secure setting that have trained staff. So you do have the beds, not sufficient beds, clearly, and most of, Jinnah, Civil, Dow, AKU, Liaquat, they all have those beds, the psychiatric beds, but the time frames have to be limited for them there because of the limitations of beds within each psychiatric ward. So each hospital has a different limitation. Some will say maximum 3 weeks, but that 3 weeks is spent purely on administering medications to reduce the symptoms and make them manageable, and then discharged. But then that's where the problem comes in. You send them home with medications. Adhering to medications is a massive problem. They will stay on it for a bit, and then bit by bit, as they start to feel better, they'll say, I don't need it. And there goes the medication, and then comes a relapse.
But how do you control that? Because I knew someone who was this, the only way I can describe him is this golden boy, good looking, smart, fabulously wealthy, lovely hair. I mean, he was this really fabulous guy.
Yeah.
And then something happened, and he seemed to just completely go off the rails, and nobody seemed to understand what was wrong, etc.
Tammy, you were giving a great example of mental illness does not discriminate.
Yeah, it doesn't. And
it does not discriminate.
The really tragic thing was he was undiagnosed for so many years that he did so much damage to himself.
Right.
That it was almost irreversible, Nobody could look after him, nobody could manage him.
Some individuals will self-medicate through alcohol or substance abuse or even pain. They may scratch themselves or cut themselves because they're trying to find relief. It may look odd to us to choose those pathways for relief, but that's what they are. The brain is such a unique mechanism that it'll try to figure out what's the best way to try to make this happen for you. So not everyone will choose the same pathway, but they will try to find relief where they can locate it. One of the earlier points that you had made, I want to go back to that for just a moment, is you were asking about what is the system being able to offer now. There was a gap. Shaheen had mentioned they're discharged. Now what? So now, in order to fill that gap, we have the recovery house, for example. It's a service that is there so that when people have been achieving gains with them and it's more inpatient based or more clinically based, now there's something more community based. So having more interventions that are rehabilitation focused is what the behavioral workforce right now is missing.
But something like the recovery house, it's got to be limited. It has to only cater to X number of people.
Sure.
Yes.
So, but again, I'll come back to this. I mean, we grew up on movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and things, and those are like extremely horrific scenes, in mental hospitals and things. And there'd be so many of these films. But I get the feeling that one is being more educated now about the gentleness that is required, the kind of care that needs to be imparted, the understanding required. There's a movie I saw recently called Still Alice.
Ah, yes, absolutely.
I mean, I had tears, but what I'm saying is that it's this kind of thing that do these kind of movies help people? Do they help caregivers and others to understand? Do they help people legislate for better budgets?
Yes, exactly. They give you language.
Yeah.
Before, we didn't have the proper language. We used to say people suffering from mental illness.
Yeah.
Even the pharmaceutical agencies that make these medications have changed their marketing. Now it's a person, hi, I'm Dr. Carey, I'm a professor, I'm a co-chair of the academy, and I have diabetes. You see, I'm a person with.
Yeah.
I'm not a diabetic, right? I'm a person with schizophrenia. I'm not a schizophrenic. So we're trying to reduce that stigma. And even the pharmaceutical companies who persons are utilizing their goods are even changing how they're approaching it.
So you said there was a huge breakthrough, and this is the first time you have the kind of medication.
Yes.
And obviously it'll become better over the years, I'm sure, as more and more research. But is that medication available in places like Pakistan? Because not all therapies come to Pakistan. We have a very bad patent regime and things. So
no, the majority of medications are available. So today there are, when we started off with illness in our family, there was one single medication called Thorazine. That was it. A lot of ECTs, electroconvulsive therapies, but today there are at least 20 medications, and every single person that has a diagnosis responds to a different medication. They don't all have the same outcomes for each one. So, but more and more each day there is research being done, new medications are coming out, which is helping the process, that the outcomes of those medications are such that rehabilitation steps in to say one is allowing them to work with each other. That is there. That one medication might subdue them or perhaps make them a little more sedate, but they were still not with that single medication at the point where you could have a conversation and teach them and educate them and teach them skills. Now the medications have just amazing results, which is why the role of rehabilitation is so important. We need to make people functional. We need to make them have fuller lives, follow goals and their dreams. That is the exciting part.
But you know, in Pakistan, the health budget is a point of a percentage
True.
of GDP. It's I think 0.6 or something crazy.
That's true.
So how much of that do you see going to mental illness or any of it at all?
Well, you know, Tammy, the way we are pursuing this as family members.
No, I understand, because you know you can do so much philanthropy, but really the state has to intervene.
I agree.
At some point, and the state has to you know do something. It has to step up to the plate.
We have the health ministry. We don't have a segment within the health ministry as mental health. There is no specialized mental health. I think there should be. From my point of view, absolutely. When you have figures that the world, Pakistan doesn't give out, we don't collect statistics, so we don't have accurate numbers.
We haven't done a census in 100 years.
Yeah, but you know, the World Health Organization for third world countries says 1 in 3 people in our region, 1 in 3, have some form of a mental illness.
That's very frightening, because this is 200 million people, and if 1 in 3, that's a lot of people. But we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about mental illness and lack of budgets and the need for more awareness. So 1 in 3 people, according to the WHO, in the developing world.
Right.
So you know, 1 in 3, if you have that's close to 700. How much is 7 million? No, 70 million people.
Staggering
Almost
number.
70 million people.
Yes, a very staggering number.
That's a huge number, because what 200,000 is what you've got on the books, and if you have another even 50 million running around, that's scary.
But you know what is even more critical, and we don't think about it in those terms, is that one ill person affects every single one that is a caregiver. And we have large families. If you've got 4 family members, brothers, sisters, that one single illness impacts the whole home. You know, and the functionality of we're not talking about the functionality of the person living with the illness, but it impacts the functionality of the brothers, the sisters, the fathers, who's going to go to work, who's going to be able to go to school or not go to school. You multiply that number, and what is the productivity of a nation with that much?
Can I ask I mean, it's a terrible question, but there's a lot of instances where, you know, when someone is obviously either very severely deformed, has a very bad physical deformity, or has an obvious mental illness, they tend to abandon them as children. There's a lot of that happens here. So do you see that happening a lot, the people being abandoned even as adults?
Here, I'm not the best person to speak about what is happening in terms of abandonment, but absolutely, I mean, ED would have that number. A lot of people are being left at ED centers because they have no solution.
ED and Darul Sukoon, I know that Darul Sukoon have a lot of people who are abandoned.
There's sometimes people can be abandoned and still be home. right? So individuals
So living
maybe,
at home, but just
maybe
strapped
not-
to a bed or something.
or maybe not invited to functions that
I
other
have
family
seen
members are
horrific
doing.
cases where somebody was chained to a tree, with one of those long chains, and was
Right.
chained to the tree so they wouldn't wander off, or chained to a bed so wouldn't
Right.
wander
Right.
off and things like that.
I think what's going to be happening in Pakistan, this is one of the hopes that we have as a part of the work that we're drilling down, is that once people see change happening and see people going to work, going to school, getting married, living their lives, when they see people doing this, and then they say, oh, you have a mental health diagnosis, that's when you're going to see that huge change in allocations coming down. That's when the government's going to say, oh, we can make this happen quicker or smoother or faster. But right now, people aren't looking to see where are people doing things. And we had that presenter at the conference at Avari yesterday, and the individual said, I am recovered from bipolar disorder. The quick reaction is, you no longer have it. That's not the true answer. The individual still has bipolar disorder. He's learned to live, learn, work, and socialize with bipolar disorder. And he's going to school, and he is married. So there's so much
Like
people can
dementia
share.
is mental illness?
Absolutely, it's a mental health
Alzheimer's?
absolutely a mental health diagnosis.
So these are really common. I
Sure.
mean, these are hugely common.
Sure, sure.
And
Dementia or Alzheimer's don't have the same stigma as schizophrenia and bipolar or schizoaffective.
yeah.
That's accepted.
It's accepted because generally people are much, much older when they get it, and it's seen as a
Exactly.
symptom of old age, and
more
it doesn't
sympathy.
matter, it's a granny
Right.
disease kind of thing. Yeah.
The greatest gift that I was ever given as a practitioner, as a very young practitioner, was to understand where stigma comes from. In the United States, individuals who have a mental health diagnosis have this stigma because society views them as not contributing back. We work, we pay taxes. Our taxes may go towards someone who can't work or isn't working.
Right.
So the lack of productivity that the U.S. had seen historically has shifted so much so that now we have actors, we have not presidential, there's a slip, that's a Freudian slip. But we
have a
have
president.
politicians, we have individuals that are now raising their hand and saying, I have or a loved one of mine has. Because now we're reducing the stigma because we're saying, and I'm productive. I have major depression maybe, and I'm an actor in a soap opera. I have bipolar disorder, and I am the chancellor at a university. People are now raising their hands and saying, I'm diagnosed with, and still look at my
Again,
productivity.
depression, people don't see depression as a disease, they see it as a
Absolutely.
symptom of something, you're upset with something, so you got depressed because something's happened, but they don't see it as a disease in itself, and it's
Right.
very dangerous.
It can be very impactful.
Right.
If someone is at a university and it's the first time they're away from their family, and
Suicide
depression
watch.
or anxiety, exactly. They may start drinking, they may start drugging, they may have a suicidal ideation. It doesn't come from nowhere, right? And they may try to meet the needs of it by those mechanisms, those pathways I had mentioned earlier, but they're not the best solution. So
Right.
that's why there's so much more support on campuses than ever before.
What about children? Dealing with children.
Well, unfortunately, Tammy, the last several years have illustrated that children are now being diagnosed with serious mental illness more so than ever before. There's a group.
Why is that?
Well, we don't exactly know. There's a lot of research going on to determine that. It may be social economic reasons. There could be because of the trauma events that may be happening in individuals' lives. There is a lot of research about why. There's a special population that we're looking at called emerging adults and transition age youth. That's that 16 to something year old, 26, 25-year-old group. They don't want to be in program with a 9-year-old, and they're too young to be in program with a 45-year-old. They have a special need. So there's a lot of science and interventions coming out for just that special population.
So are you bringing some of that here to Pakistan
Absolutely.
and training people how to deal?
Absolutely.
Because children require a completely different kind of
Exactly.
handle.
Exactly. And there's a whole children and youth and family sort of project that comes out of our association. We have two different types of designation of competency that we're trying to bring to the Pakistani workforce. The adult one is called Certified Psych Rehab Practitioner, and the other one is called Children and Family Resiliency Practitioner. So you can see how the workforce in both of those are going to help meet the needs of that population, and we're going to do so from maybe two different perspectives, still seeking the same outcome.
Okay, so if you look at, are you just working in Karachi or are you working in other parts of the country?
Well, our attention has been in Karachi, but we're hoping to make this a movement. We want this to be a workforce, which means we want to spread this around the country so more people can benefit and have the same outcomes that persons are getting that are utilizing TRH, the recovery house here in Karachi.
Because Karachi, generally it's sort of more, it's urban, so it's more urbane, people are better educated, there's more access to facilities, schools, information, television, the internet.
Right.
But if you go out of Karachi into the rural areas, then you don't have any of these. You have neither the schools nor the infrastructure nor television, none of this. So, it's probably much more difficult for them to understand and to grasp. So how do you see this going forward? I mean, what's the plan? I mean, do you have a plan for X number of years, and how do you see this continuing and fanning out?
This is most certainly going to be a rollout.
Okay.
Right? So we're going to have it as a sequence in a series. In order to have a rollout, you have to send out your competent drones, if you will. So we need to have sort of a team that will then dialogue with maybe someone who's more in the villages, or maybe someone who is in Islamabad, because I don't know of any rehabilitation programs there. So we have a strategy that it's going to take years. In the U.S., this took several years. It wasn't an overnight sensation. It took years. But we have that evidence behind us now. Right. So maybe we can get that startup here faster and the outcomes here sooner.
Right. I mean, the plan initially was that to provide trainings to existing institutions that already have the infrastructure and who are already delivering some form of services and have a staff. So why not educate the staff in rehabilitation services? And that is where we began almost 10 years ago, by bringing a team and developing a specific plan for them. And we started with Karwan-e-Hayat. We developed a 5-year plan at no cost to them in that process. And we delivered that to say, okay, you're delivering clinical services, which are medication-based. If you add on rehabilitation services, over a period of time, a culture of rehabilitation will develop. And so that institution will then be servicing their existing clients. And then we, which is the Caravan of Life, would then move to another institution and do the same. That was our initial plan, to go building institutions that way. We didn't quite get the kind of outcomes that we had hoped for, in the sense a lot of relearning needed to happen as they were doing. That is hard, and that's an experience that is also prevalent in the US. They're used to functioning a certain way, and now you come in and say, do it like this. That means you first have to relearn, unlearn, and then relearn. That is not easy. So we had to rethink this process and say, it has to be done from scratch. Start from the foundation, and that is where the recovery house came in, to develop a team with the foundations and then build that up. So as you say, the process has to begin small. We need to have a team adept at doing this.
But you're creating a model. So
we're creating a model. That's what it is. If you create a model,
then anyone else can pick up your model and run with it, right?
That is that's the only goal of the two caravans.
Because that's the only way to scale up.
Right. To scale up and to scale out.
Right.
And to scale out.
So we're looking for your territories that are around to also do that.
Because the model, again, it doesn't include replicating anything that I see in the US. We're not replicating. We have to modify every single thing to be a cultural fit. So we are at that point where we have components of our model pretty much in place to say this is what the model in Pakistan is going to look like. And then it is open for other peoples to,
What are the things that exist in Pakistan that make it easier for you to work? I would imagine like having a big family where
that's a major plus point. And we see that as a partner. We already have an existing partner So we do family psychoeducation, which means you educate the family in the process as and when their family member gets better and is ready to go home. You want them to be able to deal with them where relapses, rehospitalizations are prevented. So that process is very, very critical for us, and that is a major, component of. I view that as an advantage. On the other hand, in the U.S., are not part of that process because of privacy laws, right? So that is a definite advantage, and we've also found that going out to and speaking to employers, they are open, they are receptive. We are able to find a placement for a client of ours at the recoveries that is ready for employment. That is again a benefit.
But when you say ready for employment, that means someone has gone through therapy, etc., medication,
Yes.
hospital, whatever needs to be done.
Yes.
And then they're in the recovery house and they come
Right.
out. But as you
Right.
said, it's something that's always there. They have to be monitored, etc.
Right.
So has there ever been a situation where something has gone wrong and you've had an employer ring up and say, you sent me someone and he's not stable or she's not stable?
Right.
We haven't had anyone return to TRH for that reason, but we have had some on-site conversations because
Okay.
of those reasons.
So you've
Right.
managed to deal with those.
Exactly.
But I think it's a tremendous thing because it's a really difficult and tough job, and it's as they say. But I think that it has to be gratifying to, even if you can help 10 people, it's got to make a huge difference in your lives. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here, for coming to Pakistan, for doing all this, and I hope it's not another 3 years before I see you again and have you back on TV. But if you're
Thank
here
you.
next year, then we can maybe do a follow-up on this and
Thank you
and
so
see
much.
what the next phase is
Absolutely.
and what you're doing. But Dr. Veronica Carey and Shaheen Ahmed, thank you both very, very much for being
Thank
here
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you for having
and
us.
from Pakistan also, thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to know any more information about this, you can get in touch with them. They have an organization here, and there's a setup called the Recovery House. You can check them out online, and perhaps you will even be motivated to go help, volunteer, donate, do whatever. But I think we all need to do our part in Pakistan to help people who are less, who have less than we do. I mean, if somebody needs, some sort of medication or help, or even financial help, or just somebody to go and read to them, or talk to them, whatever, it might be something worthwhile looking into. I will see you again on the next Business Plus special as and when. Take care and good night.